This video is sponsored by the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Brooklyn College. We are here. Welcome back, party people. Mike here with The Social Life of Language, and today we are covering an article by Claudia Cervantes-Soon entitled A Critical Look at Dual Language Immersion in the New Latino Diaspora. So we'll be thinking about this explosion of English-Spanish dual language programs all across the country, where it is claimed that both languages are treated equally and that users of Spanish and users of English are taught together, with the ideal result being that both groups of students will walk away with a full English-Spanish proficiency. However, this is the United States, where ideals necessarily interact and clash with things like race and racism and ever-adapting forms of capitalism. And if we aren't aware of these factors, even something like bilingual education can become what the author calls a double-edged sword. So why is this happening? Let's find out. So first, let's take a minute to talk about why we fought for bilingual education in the first place. Now, this is not a new fight, and it entails a long racist American history, culminating in many social justice events and movements, which was all part of a larger critique of a distinctly white supremacist culture embedded in American education itself. But what does that mean for white supremacist culture to be built into education? Let's think of a simple example here. If we look at historical battles, Mexicans are almost always presented as the bad guys, even when they are fighting against white supremacist enslavers. And these exact white supremacists are usually portrayed as heroes and get statues and even schools and universities named after them. My absolute favorite example of this comes from San Juan, Texas. Today, there is a school named Stephen F. Austin. Now, Austin was a slave owner that killed countless Mexicans. The Mexicans who fought against him were trying to prevent the expansion of slavery into that geographic area. Oh, and probably the best part of this story is that that school in San Juan, Texas is probably about 99% Mexican heritage children. Does anyone feel the racist irony here? So an important aspect of white supremacist culture presupposes that the will of America and whiteness can do no wrong. That is white supremacy in the form of narratives and stories, as well as statues and school names and history books. All of that is textbook white supremacy. Get it? Textbook white supremacy, because the students, they're reading the text. Nobody cares. During the early legal battles of the civil rights era, bilingual education itself was viewed as a mechanism to disrupt this white supremacist culture in American education. So bilingual education was kind of framed as this anti-racist strategy. Now, all these years later, bilingual education is seemingly shifting away from this frame, particularly in the marketing. We have seemingly stopped talking about bilingual education as this anti-racist strategy. Instead, we're starting to see bilingual education framed in the language of markets and competition, or what some scholars call neoliberalism. So right here, before we go on, we gotta know what the F neoliberalism is so that we can better understand this article. So let's figure out what neoliberalism is by thinking about some of the central claims present in regular old liberalism. And then let's kind of see how these older liberal claims overlap with these supposedly newer neoliberal claims. Now, one of the central tenets to old school liberalism is the idea that men, literally white men, had the right to own property, and that men should be free to protect their property at all costs. That idea is even inscribed in the Constitution, where property ownership is framed as this natural right. And in the Fifth Amendment, the Constitution says that even criminals deserve protections specifically in regard to life, liberty, and property. So in phrases like that, you see the idea of property and property rights as elevated to the status of liberty and life in general, meaning that property as a concept overlapped with the idea of liberty, or what today we might call freedom. So here we might say that in the United States, freedom and property ownership are two sides of the same coin. Now, in combination with concepts like freedom and property, we have the freedom to do what we want with that property, such as buying and selling, which means that we also need to have a free market driven by free competition. So now we can kind of see how these earlier forms of liberalism was informed by, but also helped produce the conditions where free market capitalism can thrive. Plus, let's remember that all these claims together constitute a theory of how a society of individuals could or should operate. Okay, so that is a simplified summary of some of the central claims in liberal thought. Now, when it comes to the idea of neoliberalism, some scholars suggest that these earlier old school liberal propositions, especially the parts about property, competition, and free markets, some scholars are observing that these ideas have expanded across the entire world, what some folks call globalization. Now, one concrete example of this is the movement of giant corporations to countries known for exploitative labor practices. However, under an ideology of free markets and competition, corporations should be free to pay what they want to pay and hire who they want to hire, if indeed they want to be competitive in this capitalist free market. Because at a basic level, if you pay less and hire more people doing the same job, that might be a way to make your corporation as monetarily efficient as possible, which might have the effect of cutting costs, which might then allow a corporation to sell cheaper, which then makes you more competitive as a corporation. Okay, so that is a large international example of neoliberalism in action. So all those logical steps, that kind of reasoning about what can be rightfully done with property, we might call that a neoliberal reasoning, or maybe a capitalist mentality. Because when all that reasoning comes together, it appears to explain away the necessity of exploitation in order to maximize profit. It all seems to make sense and appear logical. So under this neoliberal reasoning or capitalist mentality, we aren't worried about creating equality, and we're not thinking about creating a just society. It's kind of the opposite. We are looking to create dominant corporations and dominant institutions that both hoard wealth and also put weaker corporations out of business. Now, there are social theorists who suggest that more and more individual people are adopting this capitalist mentality and this corporate style reasoning as a way to run every aspect of life, meaning that more and more people are making basic decisions while treating themselves as though they were a business. For example, we might go to college to invest in ourselves. Can you see that business style reasoning there? Specifically, how the idea of investment can literally become the reason a person goes to college? Or how about the decision to maybe study this but not that, because only one of those specializations will bring you more money in the future, while the other might not bring you the same level of opportunity. But notice this very much resembles a cost-benefit analysis. How about the decision to date someone based on how much money they make? We can see how these economic factors are playing in more and more into basic daily life. Now, in regard to American education, it is thought by some people that this corporate style reasoning should even inform our policy writing. So instead of thinking of bilingual education as this mechanism of community uplift or as a social justice strategy, we've started imagining that the purpose of bilingual education is to produce workers for the marketplace. In capitalist societies, workers compete amongst themselves for jobs by presenting themselves as having this or that skill set. Plus, if you have a college degree, you're supposed to become even more competitive. So it really isn't surprising how someone might decide to send their child to this particular school that already has a thriving and robust bilingual education program, specifically so they can have this linguistic skill set to put on their college applications. So again, we are not thinking about the creation of a more equal and just society. We are thinking of students competing with one another to get into college. In other words, through this neoliberal reasoning or this capitalist mentality, we can look at language learning as a self-investment to become a competitive worker that knows two languages in a bilingual world. And by that word world, we are usually indirectly invoking the idea of globalization or a global marketplace. So some theories of neoliberalism propose that this capitalist mentality has infiltrated every aspect of daily life, where literally anything and everything can be framed as a thing of economic value, including knowledge of a second language. On top of that, we have gotten in this habit of casting ourselves and others as competitors selling themselves on the market. We might say that the word neoliberalism refers to both capitalist practices, but also that form of reasoning which produces very specific outcomes. Cervantes-Soon's article is explicitly saying that we need to start thinking really hard about how we are framing bilingual education through this type of corporate style reasoning. Now, it was really in the 90s when scholars began seeing patterns emerge in the way we were talking about bilingual education, where educational conversations began factoring in how a second language can make students more competitive in the marketplace, meaning their linguistic knowledge might lead to better jobs and better pay. But the underlying message here is that language and language skills can themselves be bought and sold in the marketplace. In this article, Cervantes-Soon presents evidence of where bilingual education seems to be going when we think of bilingual education through the language of neoliberalism, where we employ capitalist concepts like competition and self-investment, and of course practices like resource allocation, as well as knowledge skills for the purpose of becoming a global worker, where we employ capitalist concepts like competition and self-investment and resource allocation. And a big problem here is that policy writers and decision makers might not be thinking this all the way through, or even worse, they might not be thinking about this at all. Scholars interested in bilingual education began warning in the 90s that this strategy could potentially have some really bad side effects. Some predicted that slowly and over time, if we framed bilingual education in the language of economics, or say that second languages are economic resources and objects of competition, then bilingual education itself will stop being about fixing educational inequalities or fulfilling an anti-racist agenda. Instead, language and language skills would themselves become resources, which is another way of saying a form of property that can be fought over. And this would mean that upper class and more privileged members of society would then become interested in taking that resource for themselves. In this 2014 article, Cervantes-Soon is going to present evidence that this was or is happening in North Carolina, where at the time the Latinx population was seeing unprecedented growth. The state of North Carolina began implementing two-way immersion programs in the 90s to great success. But if we look at the history of these programs, we see that two-way immersion was originally designed as an effort to teach foreign languages to native English speakers. English speakers were the priority, while the language minoritized students were let into these programs to help fulfill that priority or help achieve that goal. And here is something we need to be aware of. Blatantly giving priority to the already privileged native English-speaking students has become a way that many bilingual education programs gain public support and actually become a reality in schools. Or as the author says, for two-way immersion programs to become a reality, they must be attractive enough to politicians and parents of the dominant group. Okay, so then how does one appeal to these politicians and dominant groups? Those who have established two-way immersion programs across the country have resorted to various marketing strategies, such as emphasizing a strong academic focus, selecting campuses in desirable locations, and framing two-way immersion as a form of gifted education. This marketing strategy is happening all across the United States. Now remember, the fight for bilingual education has a very long and violent history. But nowadays, when it comes to marketing bilingual programs, we don't really talk about any of that stuff. Instead, the author considers this a widespread effort to sanitize the image of bilingual education. So for one, let's not even say the word bilingual. Why don't we call it two-way immersion? Or how about dual language education? Or even better, let's frame it as world language education. That is the approach taken in North Carolina, where at the state level, world language education is being deliberately detached and distanced from ESL programs. And that stands for English as a Second Language. So again, we gotta ask, why is this happening and what kind of effects can we expect? I think the author says it best here. The housing of two-way immersion in world languages, which is another face of foreign language education, has had a sanitizing effect that, while necessary to attract supporters of the dominant group, including conservative legislators, reifies a neoliberal ideology that can lead to an easy disregard of equity issues. This is why the author calls this approach a double-edged sword. Because in a way, it's making all these bilingual education programs possible and a reality, but when we take a closer look, we are realizing that we are directing those efforts away from the folks who need it the most. And in this context, we're talking about Latinos in North Carolina. Okay, so let's look at some concrete examples of this neoliberal corporate-style reasoning in action. Cervantes-Soon tells about a really crazy scenario where this magnet school was trying to implement a two-way immersion program. And part of the way that they attempted to sell this idea is to suggest that it was also a cost-saving measure. In one report, they say, as dual language programs grow at a school site, the need for ESL resource teachers is reduced, resulting in cost savings or the ability to reallocate staff positions. So look at all that corporate reasoning in there. It has all of the things. We got cost savings, we got efficiency, we got waste reduction, we got resource reallocation, and in the service of world language education. And remember, whenever we see that word world, we're kind of indirectly hinting or invoking the idea of globalization. At this point, we have moved very far away from ideas of social justice or anti-racism or community uplift. Now remember, in this 2014 article, world language education is not working together with ESL. ESL programs, for the most part, explicitly advocates for language minoritized students. That is not happening with world language education. So who is world language education actually designed for? Well, we can kind of figure it out by looking at the marketing. For example, the author tells us about this one website that claims two-way immersion would give students an edge, which is again a kind of corporate style reasoning, because in other words, that student is allegedly going to be more competitive when applying for a job or a university. Cervantes-Soon even found that there were 3 schools that explicitly required a strong foundation in English in order to be admitted into this program. So that means if you're not already a native English speaker, you are not allowed into these programs. So again, we are moving very far away from community uplift and equality and social justice. Cervantes-Soon says, ironically, while schools are often set up to bring language minority students into the mainstream and cultivate identities rooted as monolingual English speakers ashamed of speaking their home language, Spanish and bilingualism appears to be thriving among non-Latinos. Okay, let's do a couple more examples before we go. Next, we can look at material from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. So these are the folks that help develop curriculum and guidelines. Their claim is that two-way immersion will help both dominant language users and minoritized language users. But if we look at the program descriptions on the website, a clear priority emerges. Here's the description of two-way programs, grouping native speakers of English with native speakers of the target language. Okay, fine. Let's look at the description for full immersion programs, serving native speakers of English in an environment where the target language is used exclusively. Next is a description of partial immersion programs, serving native speakers of English in an environment where the target language is used for some portion of the day. Okay, so at this point, it's kind of just telling you that these programs are designed to serve native speakers of English. That is the obvious priority. Now, let's say you're a user of the target language. You gotta wonder if these non-English users will be used to serve the needs of native English users. In other words, in these kinds of statements, it kind of positions non-English users as little more than resources for English users. So the thing is, people have predicted this exact scenario. Cervantes-Soon quotes another scholar. They say, dual immersion programs have the potential of becoming the Epcot Center of Foreign Language Curriculum, providing language majority students an opportunity to view live specimens of the second language. Okay, so on a final note, let's remember that marketing does not always align with what is actually happening in the classroom. There are countless teachers doing social justice and anti-racist work in their bilingual classrooms. But I think one of the larger points that this article is making is that if we want American education to transform society for the better, then fostering a critical consciousness will be necessary to better understand what we're doing right and what we need to change, like now, like yesterday. Without a vigilant implementation of two-way immersion programs and strong advocacy efforts, these contexts might lead to an increased reliance on the language of neoliberalism, an emphasis on appealing to the dominant group, and the reinscription of unequal power relations between majority and minority groups deeply rooted in US society. So where do we go from here? Well, let's start with some basic questions. Will these specific kinds of bilingual programs result in a more equitable society? Or will employing this capitalist mentality and marketing strategy simply maintain the status quo? Well, I mean, perhaps we just gotta remember that in a capitalist society, equality does not sell. Well, that's all for today, folks. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and do please donate to the Patreon account. You can find all my articles and publications on maestromikemena.com. Once again, I'm Mike with The Social Life of Language, and we're done.